What would you do if one phone call had the power to change your life forever? Clara Henderson was a widowed accountant struggling to keep the lights on in her tiny apartment. Jonathan Pierce was a billionaire CEO with everything except the truth. He needed a wife, not out of love, but to cover a lie that had grown too large to control. And Clara. She needed money more desperately than she ever wanted to admit. So, when two lonely lives collided in an arrangement built on deception, what began as a business deal quickly turned into something neither of them expected. But can love born in lies ever survive the light of truth? What happens when a fake marriage starts to feel dangerously real and the whole world is watching? This is not just a story about wealth and power. It's about grief and healing, masks and vulnerability, and the terrifying courage it takes to begin again. Stay with me until the end, because what starts as a dangerous charade will become a lesson in love, honesty, and second chances. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss stories that touch the heart and stir the soul. The phone rang at 7:12 in the morning, a sharp, insistent sound that sliced through the silence of Clara Henderson's tiny kitchen. She was bent over a chipped formica table, bills spread out before her like enemy soldiers ready to charge. Her coffee had gone cold in the mug, but she hadn't noticed. Numbers swam in her mind, red ink circling her bank account like a hawk. Clara pressed the receiver to her ear, her voice still rough with sleep. "Hello." The voice that answered didn't belong in her modest Ohio apartment. It was clipped, professional, with a rhythm that carried authority. "Mrs. Henderson. This is Amelia Cross, assistant to Mr. Jonathan Pierce." Clara frowned, rubbing her forehead. "I'm sorry, who Mr. Jonathan Pierce, chairman and CEO of Pierce Energy Solutions. He would like to meet with you today regarding a confidential opportunity. Can you be in Chicago by noon?" Clara nearly laughed. She was sitting in her faded pajamas, hair tied in a loose bun, with a stack of overdue utility bills staring her down. Chicago by noon. She could barely afford gas to the grocery store. "I think you must have the wrong number," Clara said, trying to sound polite. "I don't know anyone named Pierce." Amelia's tone didn't budge. "There is no mistake. Mrs. Henderson, you were chosen deliberately. Transportation will be arranged. Mr. Pierce requests that you arrive at his office at 12 o'clock sharp. Business attire, please." And then the line clicked dead. Clara stared at the phone as if it might explain itself. Pierce Energy Solutions. She had seen the name splashed across newspapers and business journals, a company worth billions, led by a man who'd once been called the coldest genius in America. But why in heaven's name would a man like Jonathan Pierce know her name? Her eyes drifted back to the bills, the late notice on her mortgage, the credit card balance that refused to shrink, and most painful of all, the medical invoices from her mother's nursing home, the numbers climbing higher each month like ivy crawling up a wall. Clara had been strong for years, holding everything together after losing her husband in a car accident. She'd raised their daughter, worked long nights, and swallowed her grief because life left her no choice. But lately, even her strength felt like it was cracking. She whispered into the quiet kitchen, as if to herself, "What am I supposed to do with this?" The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked. And somehow, impossibly, she found herself packing a small black blazer she hadn't worn since her husband's funeral. By 11:58, Clara stood in front of a skyscraper that made her knees feel weak. Pierce Tower rose into the Chicago sky like a gleaming blade, its glass exterior catching the sun so fiercely she had to squint. She smoothed the wrinkles from her blazer and told herself not to bolt back to the bus terminal. Inside, the lobby was all marble and silence, the kind of place where her scuffed flat squeaked too loudly on the floor. A receptionist with perfect hair and a diamond pin looked her up and down before asking for her name. Clara gave it, half expecting to be laughed out of the building. Instead, she was handed a visitor's badge, 43rd floor. "Mr. Pierce is expecting you." The elevator doors closed around her. Clara pressed her palms together, whispering the prayer she always used before hard conversations. "Please, God, just help me stay steady." Jonathan Pierce's office was the size of her entire apartment. The windows stretched from the floor to ceiling, framing Lake Michigan like a private painting. At the center stood a man she recognized immediately, though she'd only ever seen him on magazine covers. Tall, broad-shouldered, his suit cut with the kind of precision that spoke of power. His hair, once dark, was flecked with distinguished silver at the temples. His face was handsome, yes, but in the way a sculpture might be: sharp, controlled, without softness. He didn't offer a smile. Instead, he extended a hand. "Mrs. Henderson, thank you for coming." Clara hesitated only a moment before taking his hand. His grip was firm, professional, but there was something underneath a quiet intensity, like heat beneath stone. "I wasn't sure why I was asked to come," she admitted, sitting in the chair his assistant indicated. "I'm just an accountant, a very ordinary one." Jonathan Pierce studied her, his piercing gray eyes making her want to squirm. "There is nothing ordinary about you, Mrs. Henderson." The words unsettled her. He leaned back, folding his hands. "I'll be frank. What I'm about to propose will sound unusual, but it is entirely legal, and you will be compensated beyond your imagination. $600,000 for 10 days of work." Clara's breath caught. She thought she'd misheard. 600,000. 10 days. That was more money than she'd see in a lifetime of filing taxes for small businesses in Ohio. She tried to steady her voice. "I don't understand. What could you possibly need me for?" Jonathan's gaze never wavered. "I need a wife." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the city below. Clara blinked, sure she'd misheard again. "I'm sorry. What?" "A wife," he repeated, matter of fact, as if he were asking her to balance a spreadsheet, for appearances only. "A temporary arrangement. 10 days on a humanitarian cruise where I must present myself as a married man. Afterward, the contract ends. You return home, and your financial burdens vanish." Clara's mouth went dry. She looked out at the endless stretch of lake, then back at the man whose expression revealed nothing. A fake wife. The thought was absurd, humiliating, terrifying, and yet her mind flashed back to that stack of bills on the kitchen table, to her mother's frail hands clutching hers, whispering not to worry, to the gnawing fear that she was running out of options. Her heart thudded. "You can't be serious." Jonathan leaned forward slightly, and for the first time, Clara thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, not coldness, but the faintest trace of vulnerability. "I've never been more serious in my life." And in that moment, Clara Henderson realized her world was about to be turned upside down. The elevator doors slid open with a muted chime, and Clara stepped out onto the 43rd floor, her palms still damp against the strap of her worn leather purse. The carpet beneath her feet was so thick she felt as if she were sinking into it, each step muffled in quiet luxury. The office space stretched wide and gleaming, filled with polished oak, glass partitions, and the low murmur of assistants speaking into headsets. Art hung on the walls, pieces that she recognized from glossy magazines but had only ever seen behind velvet ropes at museums. One painting in particular, a landscape of golden fields under a violent blue sky, reminded her of a place she'd once seen on a road trip with her late husband. She paused, strangely comforted, until Amelia Cross appeared beside her. "Mr. Pierce will see you now," the assistant said briskly, gesturing toward a pair of double doors made of dark mahogany. Clara smoothed her blazer, feeling suddenly aware of the coffee stain near the hem of her blouse, and forced herself forward. The doors opened to reveal a space that made her catch her breath. The office wasn't just large, it was monumental. Walls of glass framed Lake Michigan, the sunlight scattering across the water like diamonds. A desk, broad and imposing, dominated the room, its surface spotless except for a sleek laptop and a silver fountain pen. A Persian rug stretched across the floor, its pattern intricate enough to make her dizzy. And there he was, Jonathan Pierce stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, as if he were surveying an empire he had built with his own two hands. He turned slowly when she entered. He was taller than she expected, his posture straight, his presence filling the room. His suit was dark navy, tailored to perfection, the kind of fabric that whispered wealth. The silver at his temples only sharpened his striking features, high cheekbones, a jaw cut with precision, and eyes the color of storm clouds. Clara swallowed hard, wishing her shoes didn't squeak. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice deep, controlled. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," she managed, though her voice trembled. "Though I still don't know why I'm here." He gestured toward a leather chair opposite his desk. "Sit, please." She lowered herself onto the chair, which was so soft it felt indecent compared to the stiff dining chair waiting for her back in Ohio. Jonathan returned to his seat behind the desk, folding his hands as though weighing his words. "I'll get to the point," he said. "I require a wife." Clara blinked, just as she had downstairs. "I'm sorry. What a wife," he repeated evenly. "For 10 days. A humanitarian cruise along the Caribbean. Investors, philanthropists, government officials, and their families will be in attendance. Appearances are crucial. The Whitmores, Richard and Eleanor, are among my most important partners. They believe I'm a family man. That belief has helped secure certain opportunities." Clara stared at him, trying to decide if this was a test, or perhaps some elaborate joke at her expense. "You lied to them about being married." His jaw tightened. 2 years ago, I made a statement I should not have. It was convenient at the time, but the lie grew roots, and now it threatens to unravel one of the most significant partnerships of my career. If I arrive at this cruise without a wife, it will raise questions, dangerous questions, and you expect me to. She trailed off, her throat dry. "To step into that role," he said, temporarily. "You would attend dinners, charity events, and social gatherings as Mrs. Pierce. In exchange, you will receive $600,000, tax-free." Clara's mind reeled. The number was too big, too heavy. 600,000. She thought of her mother's unpaid medical bills, the heating notice on her fridge, the fear that had followed her like a shadow for years. That amount could change everything. But the words "fake wife" echoed louder in her head than the dollar signs. Her fingers twisted in her lap. "Mr. Pierce, I don't know if you understand what you're asking. I'm not—" She struggled for the right words. "I'm not someone who belongs in your world. I'm not polished. I don't wear designer gowns or know which fork to use at fancy dinners. I shop at Goodwill. I drive a car that rattles every time I hit a pothole. You could choose anyone. And you picked me?" Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. "I didn't pick you by accident. You were recommended by someone I trust. You are intelligent, discreet, and unattached. More importantly, you need this." Her cheeks burned. The humiliation of being seen so clearly was almost unbearable. "You know about my situation," she whispered. He didn't flinch. "I do, and I'm offering a solution." Clara's heart pounded. Part of her wanted to shout at him, to demand how dare he reduce her life to a problem he could purchase away. But another part, the part that had lain awake at night wondering how to keep her mother cared for, could not ignore the door he had just opened. She stood abruptly, walking toward the window. The view of the lake stretched out like forever, the sun glittering across the waves. She pressed her hand against the cool glass, trying to find her breath. "You're asking me to lie," she said finally. "I'm asking you to act," he corrected. "To play a role, nothing more." Clara turned back to him, her chest tight. "But what happens when the 10 days are over? I go back to my little house in Ohio, and you go back to—" All this, she gestured helplessly at the office, the city, the world he inhabited. "What happens to me, then?" His expression softened for the briefest moment, almost imperceptible. "You go back free of debt, free of worry, with choices you didn't have before." The silence stretched between them, thick as the lake air before a storm. Clara felt the weight of her morals on one shoulder and the crushing burden of her bills on the other. "Finally," she whispered, almost to herself. "This is madness." Jonathan's gaze didn't waver. "It's business." And Clara realized, with a sick twist in her stomach, that business was the only language this man seemed to speak. But even so, could she afford to say no? Jonathan Pierce did not rush. He never seemed to. Every word, every gesture carried a weight that suggested he had already calculated the consequences before he opened his mouth. Clara sat opposite him, the soft leather chair swallowing her, while her hands twisted nervously in her lap. The offer still rang in her ears. $600,000. 10 days. A wife. It sounded simple. Too simple. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his gray eyes steady on her. "I imagine you're wondering how a man like me finds himself in a situation like this." "That would be putting it mildly," Clara said, unable to keep the edge out of her voice. He almost smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. 2 years ago, I was negotiating with Richard Whitmore. He and his wife, Eleanor, are deeply traditional people. Family matters to them in ways business does not. At a dinner, he asked if I was seeing anyone. I made the mistake of saying yes, and then without thinking I said I was married. Clara blinked. "You lied." "Just like that." "It was convenient," Jonathan admitted, his voice low, deliberate. "I thought it harmless. I assumed the matter would be forgotten. But Eleanor became fixated on the idea. She has always wanted me to bring my wife to their gatherings. For years I have found excuses. But this cruise, there is no excuse left. If I arrive alone, everything unravels." Clara shook her head, incredulous. "So, because of one lie, you now need me to play house in front of billionaires?" "Yes." His answer was flat, unapologetic. Her chest tightened. She thought of the Whitmores, of Eleanor with her polished pearls and penetrating eyes, of a circle of people who lived in a world Clara had only seen through television screens. She would be stepping into that world as a fraud, her every move scrutinized. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "And what, exactly, would I be required to do?" Jonathan's gaze didn't waver. "You would accompany me at dinners, attend social events, smile at the right moments, hold my hand when expected. You would be introduced as Mrs. Pierce, and you would behave accordingly." Her cheeks burned. "So, what you expect me to, pretend I'm in love with you?" Something flickered across his expression, too fast to name. "Pretend to be comfortable with me, to appear devoted." The Whitmores believe in romance, in affection. They expect couples to be tactile, warm, a look, a touch, the occasional kiss on the cheek, nothing inappropriate, merely convincing. Clara's pulse hammered. She had not been kissed in years, not since her husband's funeral. The idea of a stranger's touch, especially this stranger's, unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Her voice shook. "And if I say no, if I walk out right now, then I will find someone else," Jonathan said evenly. But for the first time since she met him, his voice carried something else, a faint shadow of disappointment. Clara swallowed hard. He was giving her a choice, but it didn't feel like one. Behind her eyes flashed images of her mother, fragile in her nursing home bed, whispering apologies for being a burden. She saw the stack of bills, the relentless numbers pulling her life underwater. $600,000. Enough to keep the lights on. Enough to pay the nurses who cared for her mother. Enough to buy back a little dignity. Her throat ached. "This isn't just business," she whispered. "This is lying. To people who trust you." Jonathan leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, his eyes sharp as a blade. "Mrs. Henderson. Business is lying dressed in better clothes. Deals are made on appearances, on carefully constructed stories. This is no different. It is theater. You and I will simply play our parts." Clara let out a hollow laugh. "And I suppose I'm supposed to be flattered that you think I can pass for your wife." For the first time, Jonathan's lips curved into the barest hint of a smile. "You're intelligent, articulate. and grounded. You have the rare ability to make people believe you mean what you say. That is more valuable than beauty alone. The compliment startled her, though she couldn't tell if it was genuine or another calculated move. She rose from her chair and walked to the window again, the endless expanse of Lake Michigan glinting beneath the afternoon sun. Her reflection stared back at her tired eyes, a face marked with lines of worry, hair pulled back without care, a woman who had worked too hard for too little, a woman who had nearly forgotten what it felt like to be wanted. What am I doing? She asked herself silently. What kind of person agrees to something like this? Behind her, Jonathan's voice broke the quiet. 600,000, everything paid for. You'll want for nothing. And when it ends, you'll have the freedom to choose a different life. No more debt. No more scraping by. Clara pressed her fingertips to the glass, her heart heavy. Freedom. That word tasted sweet and dangerous at the same time. She turned, meeting his storm-gray eyes. You really believe money can fix everything, don't you? No, Jonathan said softly. But it fixes most things. The silence between them deepened. Clara could hear her own heartbeat, feel the tug of war in her chest, her morals against her desperation, her fear against her hope. Finally, she exhaled. 10 days. That's all? That's all? Jonathan confirmed. Clara closed her eyes. She could already feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her shoulders. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that once she stepped onto that ship as Mrs. Pierce, nothing in her life would ever be the same. The next morning, a sleek black sedan appeared outside Clara's small Ohio home. It looked almost alien parked against the cracked sidewalk and the row of modest houses with their peeling paint and sagging porches. Her neighbor, Mrs. Dalton, peeked through the curtains, no doubt ready to spread news at the church quilting circle. Clara had half a mind to wave just to fuel the gossip. The driver, a polite man in a tailored suit, opened the door for her. Mrs. Pierce, he said without hesitation. Clara flinched at the title. She wanted to correct him, but the word stuck in her throat. She slid into the leather seat, the scent of new car overwhelming, and stared out the window as the world she knew faded into the distance. They arrived in Chicago mid-morning, stopping in front of a boutique so elegant Clara thought it was a museum. The gold letters above the glass doors spelled Maison Lavoie, a name she'd only ever seen in magazines left in doctors' offices. She hesitated on the curb, tugging at her thrift store blazer. Mr. Pierce has arranged everything, Amelia Cross said crisply, stepping out of the car behind her. Jonathan's assistant looked as impeccable as ever. Smooth hair, flawless makeup, not a wrinkle in sight, wardrobe, styling, etiquette. Consider this your orientation into Mrs. Pierce. Clara let out a nervous laugh. Orientation. Like I'm starting a new job. Amelia didn't smile. In a way, you are inside. The boutique was another world. Soft music played in the background, and the air smelled faintly of jasmine. Mannequins stood like statues, draped in gowns that shimmered like moonlight. A small army of attendants swept toward her, each more polished than the last. Mrs. Pierce. One of them greeted warmly, and Clara's cheeks burned. The name didn't belong to her. Not really. It felt borrowed, like a coat several sizes too large. Before she could protest, she was ushered into a private salon with velvet chairs and mirrored walls. Champagne appeared as if by magic, bubbles catching the light. Clara took a cautious sip, the fizz prickling her nose, and tried not to look like someone who usually drank instant coffee out of chipped mugs. The attendants moved quickly, bringing gown after gown, fabric after fabric. Clara found herself drowning in silk, sequins, and lace. One dress clung to her in places she wished it wouldn't. Oh no, she muttered, tugging at the neckline. This one looks like it's trying to start a fight. Another was so heavy with embroidery she nearly toppled. Beautiful, the attendant said brightly. Beautiful for a Renaissance painting, Clara whispered, wobbling on the pedestal. The shoes were no better, heels so tall she felt she might need oxygen. The attendants cooed over her legs, but Clara gripped the chair for dear life. Do people actually walk in these? Or just pose for pictures? The room erupted in polite laughter, but Clara's face flushed. Hours passed. Clara had lost count of the gowns when the air shifted. She felt it before she saw him. Jonathan had entered the boutique. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, surveying the scene like a general on a battlefield. His eyes moved across the racks, the attendants, and finally landed on her. Clara's breath caught. She was wearing a simple navy sheath, nothing like the ornate gowns from before. The dress skimmed her curves without clinging, dignified but soft. She caught Jonathan's eyes lingering just a second too long. Well, one of the attendants asked eagerly. Jonathan's expression remained neutral, but there was something different in his gaze, something Clara couldn't name. That one, he said finally. She'll wear that. The attendants bustled with approval, already pairing shoes and jewelry, but Clara barely heard them. Her pulse thudded in her ears. The makeover didn't end with clothes. She was whisked to a stylist who tamed her chestnut hair into soft waves, polished but not severe. A makeup artist dusted her cheeks, lined her eyes, and handed her a mirror. Clara stared at her reflection, startled. The woman looking back was her, but not her. This woman had confidence in her eyes, sophistication in her posture. This woman looked like she belonged in Jonathan Pierce's world, but deep down, Clara felt like an imposter in costume. That evening, she returned to Jonathan's office for a briefing. She had been fitted with new heels shorter this time, thank heaven, and carried shopping bags filled with garments that probably cost more than her house. Jonathan looked up as she entered. His eyes flickered just briefly before he masked them again. "You look professional," he said, his voice measured. "Professional?" Clara raised an eyebrow. "That's all?" Pause. His lips curved almost imperceptibly. "Better than professional. Convincing." Her cheeks warmed. She dropped the bags on the chair and folded her arms. "Convincing is one thing. But let's be clear. What exactly are we convincing people of? That I'm your wife? Yes, but does that mean I need to?" She stumbled over the words, embarrassed. "Do I need to act like I'm in love with you?" Jonathan studied her, silent for a long moment. "You need to act comfortable with me. To others, it must appear natural. A glance, a touch, perhaps even affection. Nothing extravagant, but yes, love, or something resembling it." Her stomach twisted. Love was sacred, not a mask. And yet she was agreeing to treat it like theater. Jonathan's voice softened. "I know this is difficult, but you can do it. You have a kind of sincerity that people believe." Clara laughed under her breath, shaking her head. "So, my honesty is the very thing you want me to lie with." His eyes lingered on her, thoughtful, precisely. That night, as Clara packed her new wardrobe into glossy luggage she had never dreamed of owning, she sat on the edge of her bed and let the weight of it all sink in. The clothes, the jewelry, the title of Mrs. Pierce, all of it felt like wearing someone else's skin. She touched the sleeve of the navy dress, still hanging by the door, and shivered. It was beautiful, it was powerful, and it terrified her. Clara whispered into the quiet, "What am I trading for this money? My pride, my truth, or something deeper?" For the first time in years, she felt a spark of fear that had nothing to do with bills or obligations. This was a different kind of danger, the danger of stepping into a lie so convincing that she might start believing it herself. The sun over Miami burned bright, gilding the harbor with streaks of gold. Clara had never seen so many yachts in her life, each one sleek and impossibly white, like floating mansions. But when the car pulled up to the pier and she caught her first glimpse of the Aurora Serenity, her breath faltered. It wasn't a boat. It wasn't even just a ship. It was a palace resting on water. 12 decks rose above the pier, gleaming like polished ivory, with balconies wrapped in glass and gold trim catching the sunlight. A red carpet stretched from the dock up the gangway, where uniformed staff welcomed guests with champagne flutes and polished smiles. Clara clutched the handle of her luggage, her mouth dry. "This isn't a cruise ship," she whispered to herself. "It's Versailles on water." Beside her, Jonathan adjusted the cuff of his blazer. Unfazed. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Remember, you're not Clara Henderson right now. You're Mrs. Pierce." The words made her stomach twist. As they approached the gangway, Clara felt eyes on her. Guests were already boarding elegant women in designer gowns, men in tuxedos or perfectly tailored suits. They glided past like swans, perfectly at ease in a world Clara had only glimpsed from the outside. She adjusted the sleeve of her navy dress, suddenly hyper-aware of every thread. The stylist had chosen well sophisticated, flattering, but understated. Still, she felt like an imposter, waiting for someone to tap her shoulder and demand proof she belonged here. Jonathan's hand brushed hers lightly, then slid into her palm with quiet certainty. The warmth of his touch startled her. She stiffened, then forced herself to relax. To anyone watching, it had to look natural, effortless. "Breathe," he murmured, so low she barely heard him. Her heart skipped. Was he reassuring her? Or himself? The lobby of the Aurora Serenity was nothing short of breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, spilling prisms of light onto marble floors. A sweeping staircase curved upward like something from a fairy tale, while an orchestra played soft jazz near a fountain where water leapt gracefully in time with the music. Clara tilted her head back, dizzy with it all. She had grown up on church bake sales and high school gym dances, not gilded staircases and champagne fountains. "Impressive, isn't it?" The voice boomed across the marble. Clara turned to see a tall man striding toward them, his silver hair shining under the chandelier. His face was ruddy, lined with years of good food, good drink, and good fortune. He wore wealth as comfortably as his linen suit. "Richard?" Jonathan said smoothly, his hand tightening around Clara's. Richard Whitmore enveloped Jonathan in a hearty handshake, clapping his shoulder. "You old fox, you finally brought her." Clara's breath caught as Richard's eyes turned to her. They sparkled with mischief and curiosity. And this must be the mysterious Mrs. Pierce. "My dear," what a vision. He bent, old-fashioned, and brushed a kiss across her hand. Clara flushed, forcing a smile. "It's an honor, Mr. Whitmore." "Richard," he corrected with a wink. Before Clara could gather herself, another presence approached a woman who moved with the grace of someone accustomed to being watched. Eleanor Whitmore, Richard's wife, was elegant in ivory silk, her pearls gleaming against skin still radiant at 60. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, lingered on Clara with the weight of an appraiser studying fine art. "So," Eleanor said with a smile that revealed nothing, "this is the woman who tamed Jonathan Pierce." Clara nearly choked. Tamed, she glanced at Jonathan, whose face revealed only polite composure. Jonathan slipped his arm around Clara's waist with practiced ease, pulling her closer. The gesture was subtle but intimate, as though it had been second nature for years. To the crowd gathering near the fountain, they must have looked like a couple perfectly in step. Clara, however, could feel her heart racing under his hand. "She's extraordinary," Jonathan said smoothly, looking at Eleanor but squeezing Clara's waist just slightly, as if to remind her to play along. Clara found her voice, surprising even herself. "And he's very persistent," she added lightly. "That's how he won me over." Richard roared with laughter. "I like her already." Eleanor tilted her head, a flicker of approval in her eyes. "Persistence can be a virtue, but let's see how she fares at dinner tonight. We'll want to hear every detail of your love story." Clara's stomach nodded. Every detail. They hadn't even agreed on a wedding date, let alone the story of how they met. Hours later, in their stateroom, Clara collapsed onto a velvet sofa, her cheeks aching from smiling. Their suite was absurdly luxurious floor-to-ceiling windows opening onto a private balcony, fresh orchids on every surface, champagne chilling in crystal buckets. But she couldn't enjoy it. Her nerves rattled like loose change in her chest. "They're going to see right through me," she groaned. "Eleanor Whitmore probably already suspects I'm some kind of fraud." Jonathan poured 2 glasses of champagne, handing one to her. His movements were steady, controlled, as though nothing could shake him. "They won't," he said simply. "Not if we're convincing." She sipped, the bubbles burning her throat. Convincing. Right. She set the glass down with a shaky laugh. "Do you realize the last time I went on a trip? It was to Branson, Missouri. With my church choir, I don't know how to play this part. Jonathan, I don't belong here." He studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, his hand covered hers. "You belong," he said quietly, "more than most of them." Clara froze. His hand was warm, steady, grounding. She should have pulled away. She should have reminded herself this was a job, a lie, a performance. But something in his tone, something softer than business, held her still. Her heart thudded. "I hope you're right," she whispered. He squeezed her hand once before letting go. "We'll make them believe." That night, as Clara slipped into a gown of midnight blue, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back didn't look like Clara Henderson. Widow, accountant, survivor of grocery store coupons and thrift store jackets. She looked like someone else entirely. Someone who could stand beside Jonathan Pierce without apology. And yet, as Jonathan offered his arm and led her toward the dining hall, Clara couldn't silence the thought gnawing at her chest. What happens when the lie feels too real? Their second evening aboard the Aurora Serenity was quiet, at least compared to the bustle of the welcome dinner. Clara sat on the velvet sofa of their suite, still feeling the weight of Eleanor Whitmore's piercing gaze from earlier that night. Every word at the table had been a test, every smile measured. Jonathan poured a glass of water and handed it to her. He hadn't touched the champagne waiting on ice. "They're watching," he said matter-of-factly. "Always. You need to remember that." Clara took the glass, her fingers brushing his. That slight touch was enough to send a nervous shiver through her. "I know," she said quietly, "but what if I fail?" "You won't," he said. Then, after a pause, "But we need to practice." She blinked. Practice. Jonathan set his glass aside, moving closer. The Whitmores expect more than polite conversation. They believe in affection, subtle gestures, quiet intimacy. If we aren't convincing, they'll notice. Clara's pulse picked up. "So? What are you suggesting?" He leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "That we rehearse. Touch, proximity, eye contact. Make it feel natural before it matters." Her throat tightened. Rehearse love. The thought was absurd and terrifying. Jonathan began with something simple. He reached for her hand. "Relax," he said softly. Clara forced her fingers to stay still in his grasp, though her instinct was to pull away. His hand was warm, steady, the kind of touch she hadn't felt in years. She remembered how her late husband's hand had once anchored her in church pews, in hospital waiting rooms, in the quiet, ordinary nights when silence pressed too heavy. Now, sitting across from Jonathan Pierce, her heart thudded like a drum. "Look at me," he instructed. She lifted her eyes. His were closer than she expected, storm gray and intent. He didn't glance away, didn't blink. "Hold it," he murmured. "When you look at me like that, others will see it as devotion." Her lips trembled. "And what do you see?" she whispered before she could stop herself. Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Next came proximity. He shifted closer, his knee brushing hers. Clara's breath caught. "This is how a married couple sits," he said. His voice was even, but his body gave away tension she hadn't seen before. She nodded, willing herself to breathe. It's an act, just an act. But when his hand slid gently to rest against her waist, her composure faltered. Comfortable, he said, though his voice had grown quieter, rougher. It has to look comfortable. Clara's heart raced. It didn't look comfortable. It felt electric. Every nerve in her body hummed. Jonathan hesitated, then asked, almost reluctantly, "Shall we try something more?" She swallowed hard. "More?" "A small kiss," he said carefully. "On the cheek. That's all." Her breath stilled. She hadn't been kissed, even in friendship, since the funeral. For years. She had lived with silence, with empty rooms and a hollow bed. Now, this man, this stranger, was asking her to offer something she had buried with her husband. But she nodded. "All right." Jonathan leaned in slowly, deliberately, as if giving her time to retreat. His lips brushed her cheek, light, fleeting, and still. Clara's pulse surged so violently she felt dizzy. She laughed nervously, pressing a hand to her chest. "This is ridiculous. It's supposed to be fake. And yet he prompted, his eyes searching hers. She shook her head quickly, standing to put distance between them. And yet my heart is pounding like I'm 16 again. Silence filled the cabin. Clara walked to the balcony doors, staring out at the dark ocean. The water stretched endlessly, the moonlight laying silver paths across the waves. She wrapped her arms around herself, whispering, "It's just a role. It has to be." Behind her, Jonathan spoke, his voice softer than before. "I know this is hard for you." Clara didn't turn. "You don't know. I know you've lost someone," he said. The words cut sharper than she expected. Her chest ached. "Yes," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I lost everything when he died. And since then, I haven't let anyone close. It was easier that way. Safer." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. Then she felt him near her, his presence steady. "I'm not asking you to replace him," he said. "I'm asking you to help me keep a promise, even if it began as a lie." Clara closed her eyes, tears stinging. "But what if pretending wakes something I'm not ready for?" Jonathan didn't answer. Instead, he gently touched her hand where it clutched the railing. Not forceful, not demanding, just a quiet offering. For the first time in years, Clara didn't pull away. Later, as she lay in the massive bed, sleep refused to come. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of the ship. Jonathan slept in the lounge area, a deliberate boundary between them, yet she could still feel his presence, the ghost of his hand against hers, the brush of his lips on her cheek. Clara pressed her palm over her heart, whispering into the darkness, "It's just work, just work." But deep inside, she knew the truth. Her heart had already stopped believing the lie. The ballroom of the Aurora Serenity glowed under chandeliers that dripped with crystals like frozen waterfalls. Gold-trimmed mirrors reflected laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of a string quartet playing somewhere near the fountain of champagne. Clara had never been in a place like this. Every detail was polished to perfection: the white-gloved waiters, the gleam of silver trays, the perfume of roses and money in the air. But beneath the sparkle, Clara's hands were trembling. She slipped her fingers into Jonathan's arm, as rehearsed. To anyone watching, they were the image of a devoted couple, handsome, polished husband and elegant wife, perfectly matched. Inside, Clara's chest felt like a cage of fluttering wings. Richard Whitmore was in his element, holding court with a circle of investors, his booming laugh echoing across the room. Clara caught glimpses of him waving his glass, tossing out jokes that landed like currency. But it was Eleanor Whitmore who held Clara's attention. The older woman floated from group to group with her champagne flute, always poised, always smiling. Yet her eyes missed nothing. When she reached Clara, she placed a gentle hand on her arm. "My dear," Eleanor said warmly, "how are you finding the ship?" Clara returned the smile she'd practiced in the mirror. "It's beautiful. I've never seen anything like it." Eleanor's lips curved knowingly. I imagine not. It takes time to grow accustomed to this world. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing with the faintest suspicion. And tell me, how did Jonathan finally convince you to marry him? He's been a bachelor for so long. Clara's heart lurched. She had rehearsed parts of their backstory, but the question still landed like a stone in her chest. She forced a laugh. Oh, he didn't have to convince me too hard. He just wore me down with persistence. Eleanor's gaze lingered, sharp, calculating, the kind of look that suggested she was peeling back layers, testing for cracks. Then, as quickly as it came, the suspicion vanished behind another polished smile. How romantic, she said. Moving on, Clara released the breath she'd been holding. But not everyone was so easily charmed. At the edge of the ballroom, Clara noticed a woman she hadn't met before. Margaret Doyle, someone whispered, an attorney with a reputation sharper than any blade. She was in her early 50s, striking in a deep emerald gown, her short blonde hair styled to perfection. She held herself with the cool detachment of a woman who saw through pretenses for a living, and she was watching Clara, not politely, not curiously, watching, the way a hawk studies a rabbit. When their eyes met, Margaret smiled, but it wasn't the kind that warmed. It was the kind that said, I know something you don't want me to know. Clara looked away quickly, her throat tightening. The pressure mounted as the evening went on. Small conversations tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Questions about vacations she'd never taken, memories she didn't share, favorite restaurants she had never heard of. Jonathan, always steady, slipped in effortlessly, filling gaps, smoothing edges, covering her stumbles. But each time he did, Clara's cheeks burned hotter. She hated feeling like the weak link. She hated knowing someone as sharp as Margaret Doyle might already be tallying her mistakes. When she excused herself to the balcony for air, her hands were trembling so badly she almost dropped her glass. The night air was cool, the ocean black beneath the stars. She gripped the railing, whispering to herself, just 10 days. Hold it together for 10 days. Behind her, Jonathan's voice came low. You're doing fine. She turned, startled. He was closer than she expected, his face shadowed by the soft golden glow of the ballroom lights spilling onto the deck. No, Clara said, her voice breaking. I'm not. Eleanor saw it. She knows something doesn't fit. And that lawyer, Margaret, she looks at me like she's already writing a brief. Jonathan stepped closer, his hand brushing hers at the railing. His touch was steady, grounding. Listen to me. They suspect nothing. Clara shook her head, her breath catching. I'm terrified I'm going to ruin everything for you. Jonathan's jaw tightened. For once, his control slipped, just a fraction. I don't care about the deal right now. She blinked. What? His eyes searched hers, fierce and protective. I care about you. If they make you uncomfortable, we leave. If they press too hard, I'll shut it down. Do you understand? Her chest ached. It was too much, too tender. This wasn't how a man acted in a role. This was instinct, and it was dangerous. When they rejoined the ballroom, Margaret Doyle was waiting near the champagne fountain. Mrs. Pierce, she said smoothly, offering her hand. I don't believe we've been introduced. Clara shook it, her pulse racing. Pleasure to meet you. Likewise. Margaret's eyes flicked to Jonathan, then back to Clara. Tell me, how long have you and Jonathan been married? 2 years, Clara answered, her voice steadier than she felt. Margaret's smile was polite, but her eyes gleamed. Interesting. I could have sworn Jonathan was attending the World Energy Summit alone. Just 2 summers ago. Clara froze. Jonathan's hand slipped into hers, strong and sure. He spoke before Clara could falter. You misremember? Margaret. Clara was there. She prefers to avoid the spotlight. Margaret's brows arched, but she let it drop with a thin smile. Of course. My mistake. She walked away, leaving Clara shaken. Jonathan leaned close, his voice low and certain. Don't let her rattle you. She thrives on fear. Clara nodded, but her heart thundered. She had stepped into a lie, and for the first time, she wondered if they could survive it without the truth clawing its way to the surface. That night, alone in their suite, Clara sat by the window, staring out at the endless black horizon. Her hand still tingled where Jonathan had held it. It had been for show. It had to be. And yet, as she replayed the way he had looked at her when he said, "I don't care about the deal right now," she wasn't sure what was real anymore. The ship cut quietly through the Caribbean waters, its lights reflecting across the endless black sea like constellations. Most of the guests had retired after the gala, retreating to their suites or to the casino, tucked away on the lower deck. The air had cooled, soft and salt-tinged, and the deck was empty except for two figures leaning against the railing. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, grateful for the quiet. For once, she wasn't being scrutinized by Eleanor's sharp eyes or Margaret Doyle's unsettling stare. For once, she could breathe. Jonathan stood beside her, a silhouette against the glow of the horizon. His posture, usually so rigid and controlled, was looser now, almost human. "You've been quiet tonight," he said at last. "I've been thinking," Clara admitted, dangerous habit. His lips curved faintly, though the smile didn't linger. Clara studied him, the way the wind tugged at the silver at his temples, the way his eyes seemed fixed on something far away. "What about you? You've hardly said a word since dinner." He hesitated, then let out a low sigh. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been if one decision had been different?" "All the time," she said softly. Jonathan nodded, his gaze still on the sea. "When I was younger, I wanted to teach, history, specifically. I loved stories of the past, the mistakes people made, the lessons hidden in dusty books. I thought if I could share those stories, maybe I could help someone else make fewer mistakes." Clara turned toward him, surprised. "You, a teacher?" He gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. "Hard to imagine now, I suppose. But yes, that was the dream." "What happened?" His face tightened, shadows passing across his features. "My father died when I was 24. He left me a company drowning in debt, with hundreds of employees whose livelihoods depended on it. I didn't have the luxury of chasing dreams. I had to keep the business alive." Clara's chest ached at the quiet resignation in his tone. "And you did." "Yes," he said flatly. "I saved the company, built it into what it is now, but somewhere along the way, I stopped being Jonathan Pierce and became the CEO, a machine that produces results, nothing more." She studied him in the dim light. For the first time, she didn't see the calculating businessman, the polished mask. She saw a man who had been forced to trade his heart for survival. "And you've been alone ever since?" she asked gently. Jonathan's jaw worked. "I had relationships, but they always ended the same way. They wanted me to be something I couldn't. Or maybe I wanted them to be someone they weren't. Either way, I learned to stop trying." He glanced at her. "And you?" Clara looked down at her hands on the railing, the way her fingers curled against the cool metal. The ache in her chest rose before she could hold it back. "My husband, Daniel, he died 12 years ago. Car accident. One of those things you can't ever prepare for. One phone call, and suddenly your whole life isn't your life anymore." Jonathan's eyes softened. "I'm sorry." She nodded, blinking against the tears pricking her eyes. "I had to figure everything out alone, raising our daughter until she left for college, working every job I could find. Nights I couldn't sleep because the bills wouldn't stop coming. Mornings I wanted to stay in bed but couldn't because someone had to keep the world turning." Her voice caught, raw and unguarded. And through it all, the worst part wasn't the work. It was the silence. Walking into a house where no one said your name, eating at a table with one plate instead of two. Learning how to laugh again when half of you was gone, the words hung between them, fragile as glass. Jonathan reached for her hand, Not calculated this time, not rehearsed, just a quiet instinct. His fingers wrapped around hers, steady, human. "I know that silence," he said softly. Clara looked at him then, really looked, and something shifted inside her. Beneath the steel and the polish, beneath the reputation and the wealth, he was just a man carrying loneliness the way she carried her own. Different paths, different burdens, but the same hollow ache. They stayed like that for a long time, their hands joined against the backdrop of the ocean's endless horizon. The conversation slowed, but neither of them pulled away. Finally, Clara broke the silence. "It's strange, isn't it? We're pretending to be husband and wife in front of the world, but tonight feels more real than anything we've done so far." Jonathan turned his gaze to her. His eyes weren't cold, weren't distant. They were searching, almost vulnerable. Maybe that's because tonight, we're not pretending. Her heart stumbled at the words. She wanted to argue, to remind them both that this was temporary, that their connection was born in shadows and lies. But instead, she found herself whispering, "Maybe you're right." Later, when they returned to their suite. Clara lay awake long after Jonathan had retreated to the lounge. She stared at the ceiling, her fingers brushing the spot where his hand had held hers on the deck. The warmth still lingered, and for the first time in 12 years, the silence didn't feel so crushing. The ballroom glittered with gold light and music. A live orchestra filled the air with the sweeping strains of a waltz, while couples spun across the polished marble floor, gowns brushing against tuxedos in a swirl of elegance. Clara stood at the edge, clutching her champagne flute like a lifeline. She had never felt more out of place. Jonathan, as always, was flawless. He moved through the crowd like a man born to it, shaking hands, exchanging quiet words with investors, every smile measured. He looked like he belonged here, and she felt like a woman wearing someone else's skin. But then she caught Eleanor Whitmore's eyes from across the room, sharp, assessing, as if the older woman had been watching her every move all evening. And beside Eleanor, Margaret Doyle lingered, her smile tight, her gaze uncomfortably knowing. Clara's pulse quickened. They're watching. They're waiting for me to stumble. She turned to Jonathan, desperate to retreat, but before she could whisper a word, Eleanor began walking toward them, Margaret at her side. Jonathan saw them too. His jaw tightened, and for a split second, Clara glimpsed something rare, hesitation. Then, without warning, he moved. He took her glass, set it aside, and in one fluid motion, pulled her into his arms. "What are you?" she began, startled, and then his mouth was on hers. It should have been staged, a kiss to silence suspicion, a trick of theater, nothing more. That was what she expected. But the moment Jonathan's lips touched hers, the world fell away. The orchestra faded, the laughter dulled. Even the weight of Eleanor's scrutiny vanished. There was only the heat of his mouth, the steady strength of his hand at her back, the startling tenderness in the way he held her. Clara's heart thundered. It wasn't practiced. It wasn't calculated. It was real, too real. She should have pulled back immediately, should have remembered the plan, the role, the reason, but her body betrayed her. For the briefest reckless second, she leaned into him. When Jonathan finally broke the kiss, the air between them was charged, dangerous. The room erupted in applause. Richard Whitmore roared with delight from across the floor, clapping his hands. Now that's a couple in love. Eleanor's eyes softened just slightly, and even Margaret Doyle looked momentarily disarmed. The show had worked, but Clara's knees were trembling. They excused themselves soon after, Jonathan leading her firmly out of the ballroom, down the corridor, into the safety of their suite. Clara pulled free the moment the door closed. What was that, she demanded? Breathless, Jonathan met her gaze steadily. It was necessary. They were questioning. I had to make them believe. Her chest ached. That wasn't acting. Jonathan. He didn't answer. The silence pressed heavy. She could still feel the imprint of his lips, the ghost of his hand against her back. Her pulse betrayed her, thundering like a drum. "Don't ever do that again without warning me," she whispered, though her voice shook with more than anger. Jonathan's eyes searched hers. "Did it upset you?" The question unraveled her. Did it upset her, or had it awakened something she'd buried so deeply she thought it was gone forever? She couldn't find the words. Instead, she turned away, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the desk. Jonathan stepped closer, then stopped himself. His restraint was almost palpable. "Clara," he said quietly, "whatever that was, it won't happen again unless you want it to." Her breath hitched. She wanted to scream that she didn't want it, that it was dangerous, foolish, wrong. But the truth sat heavy in her chest. She did want it, and that terrified her more than anything. That night, she lay awake long after Jonathan had retreated to the lounge. The bed felt too big, too empty, her thoughts too loud. Her mind replayed the kiss over and over, every detail etched into her memory. The warmth, the certainty, the way her body had responded as if it had been waiting all these years. Guilt gnawed at her. Daniel. Her husband's name came unbidden, sharp as glass. She saw his smile, the way he had teased her in the mornings, the sound of his laughter. She remembered the last kiss they'd shared before he left for work, that final day ordinary, fleeting, and now immortalized in tragedy. Was she betraying him by feeling something for another man? Was she dishonoring his memory by letting her heart race for Jonathan Pierce? A man she barely knew. A man she was supposed to be pretending with tears pricked her eyes. She pressed her palms to her face, whispering into the dark. "I'm sorry. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know who I am anymore." And yet, beneath the guilt, a small, dangerous truth stirred for the first time in 12 years. She felt alive. In the lounge, Jonathan sat in silence, staring at the untouched glass of scotch in his hand. He wasn't thinking about the deal, or the Whitmores, or the investors waiting to be impressed. He was thinking about Clara, about the way she had looked at him right before the kiss, startled. Yes, but also open, vulnerable, as if she had let him glimpse a part of her no one else had seen. He told himself it had been strategy, necessity. But deep down, he knew better, and that knowledge unsettled him more than any failed deal ever could. By morning, Clara emerged from the bedroom with tired eyes, her shawl wrapped tightly around her. Jonathan looked up from the table where he had been reviewing papers, his expression unreadable. Neither of them spoke of the kiss, but as their eyes met, the silence between them said everything. The line between pretending and reality had shattered, and nothing would be the same again. The mid-afternoon sun streamed through the glass dome of the ship's upper salon, where investors and their families had gathered for a networking brunch. Crystal chandeliers swung gently with the motion of the sea, while the staff served champagne and trays of delicate hors d'oeuvres. The room hummed with polite conversation and the low notes of a pianist playing near the window. Clara stood beside Jonathan, doing her best to mimic the grace of the other women. She smiled when expected, nodded when spoken to, kept her hand resting lightly on Jonathan's arm, but inside, she felt raw, restless. The memory of the kiss still lingered, gnawing at her resolve. She hadn't decided what it meant yet, whether it was a betrayal of her past or the faintest spark of a future. But she knew one thing for certain if she wasn't careful. People would see through her. And then Margaret Doyle struck. The lawyer's voice sliced through the air with a calm precision that commanded attention. "Mr. Pierce," Margaret said, rising from her chair across the room. "Forgive me for speaking out of turn, but I find myself deeply curious about something." The chatter fell silent. All eyes turned. Jonathan's posture stiffened, though his expression remained polite. "Of course, Ms. Doyle. What's on your mind?" Margaret's smile was practiced, thin, the kind that carried no warmth. "It's about your wife." Clara felt her stomach plummet. Margaret stepped closer, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "You see, I make it my business to know who sits at the negotiating table. Backgrounds, histories, reputations. It's my job, but when I tried to verify Mrs. Pierce's story, I found nothing. No marriage certificate, no record of a wedding, not even a society announcement. Rather unusual, wouldn't you say? The salon froze in collective shock. Even the pianist faltered mid-note. Clara's pulse roared in her ears. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but the words stuck like thorns in her throat. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice low but steady. Margaret, I fail to see how my personal life is relevant to the business at hand. Oh, but it is relevant, Margaret countered smoothly. Marriage is a foundation of trust. If you've lied about something as fundamental as a wife, what else might you lie about? Investors deserve transparency. Don't you agree? A murmur rippled through the crowd. Richard Whitmore cleared his throat, his booming voice silencing the whispers. Margaret, this is highly irregular. Perhaps, she replied, but not unfounded. I've gathered evidence. She held up a slim folder, even from across the room. Clara could see the neat stack of papers inside. Her hands went cold. Evidence. Margaret placed the folder on the table with theatrical weight. These documents suggest Mrs. Pierce is not who she claims to be, that this entire union is an invention. Jonathan's jaw tightened. That's enough. But Richard Whitmore's face had already darkened. Jonathan, he said slowly, tell me this isn't true. The room turned to him, waiting. Clara could barely breathe. She looked at Jonathan, saw the storm in his eyes as he weighed the choices in front of him, deny, deflect, or confess. And for the first time, she saw how much he had to lose. Not just the deal, not just the investors, but his reputation, the empire he had built from the ground up. One false step, and it could all unravel. Her heart clenched. This wasn't just about her anymore. Jonathan spoke, his voice controlled but firm. Mr. Whitmore, I have always conducted business with integrity. My company's results, my record, they speak for themselves. What my wife and I share. Margaret interrupted, her tone sharp. What you share, or what you stage. Because from where I stand, it looks remarkably like theater. Clara flinched. Richard's eyes narrowed. Jonathan, you know I value loyalty above all else. Deception, however well-intentioned, can poison everything. If you've lied to me, if you've lied to this room, then I must reconsider our arrangement. The air was suffocating. Clara felt the walls closing in, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing against her. She wanted to scream, to insist she wasn't a fraud, that she hadn't done this for greed, but for survival. But deep down, she knew Margaret was right. She was pretending, and every second she stayed, she pulled Jonathan further into the fire. Jonathan reached for her hand, his grip protective. Clara is my wife, he said, his voice ringing with conviction. Something inside her broke. He was willing to shield her, to stake everything on the lie. But how long could that last? She thought of his company, of the thousands of employees depending on his success. She thought of the lonely, tired man who had once dreamed of teaching history, who had sacrificed his own happiness for responsibility. And now, I'm the one who might cost him everything. Her throat tightened. Maybe the only way to protect him was to step aside, to end this charade before it destroyed them both. Eleanor Whitmore, silent until now, finally spoke. Her voice was measured, but her eyes pinned Clara like a hawk. Mrs. Pierce, she said softly, if you have something to say, now would be the time. Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. Jonathan squeezed her hand, urging her to stay quiet. But inside, her heart screamed. If she told the truth, she'd lose him. If she stayed silent, she might cost him everything. The room waited, and Clara, for the first time since this ordeal began, wondered if the only way forward was letting go. The night pressed heavy against the ship, the ballroom lights long extinguished. the laughter of investors replaced by the steady hum of the engines. Clara sat alone in their suite, her hands trembling as she held a pen over a sheet of hotel stationery. The words blurred before her eyes, but she forced them onto the page anyway. Jonathan, I can't do this anymore. Every smile, every touch, every word, it's all built on lies. Margaret is right. I don't belong here, and staying will only destroy everything you've worked for. You've built something extraordinary, and I won't be the one who tears it down. Please understand, this isn't about me giving up. It's about giving you the chance to hold on to the future you deserve. I'll leave quietly at the next port. Don't come after me. Thank you for the kindness you've shown me, for making me remember what it feels like to be alive. You'll never know how much that means to me. Clara? Her tears smudged the ink. She folded the note with shaking hands, placed it on the desk where she knew he would find it, and slipped out into the corridor with only a small bag in hand. When Jonathan returned from his late-night meeting with Richard Whitmore, exhaustion clinging to his shoulders, the room felt too still. He saw the note immediately. The moment his eyes fell on her handwriting, something inside him twisted. He tore it open, his chest tightening with each line. By the time he finished, his hands were shaking so badly the paper rattled. She's leaving. The thought rang through his skull like a bell. Clara, his Clara was walking away. For years, Jonathan had lived in control. Every deal, every negotiation, every move calculated, precise. But now, as he stood in the middle of the suite, clutching her letter, control deserted him. His heart thundered. His breath came ragged. He felt the terrifying sensation of unraveling, as if the foundations of his carefully constructed world had just been ripped out from beneath him. He paced the room like a man trapped. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" A voice whispered. "You wanted protection for your company, for the deal. If she leaves, the lie dies with her. He could still save everything. Call Margaret's bluff, reassure Richard, walk away with the contract intact." But even as the thought flickered, another voice surged louder, fiercer. And lose Clara. His mind replayed the nights on the deck, the way her voice had trembled when she spoke of her husband, the way her hand had fit into his as if it had always belonged there. He remembered the kiss, the one that had burned away every illusion, the one that had shown him the truth. He loved her. The realization hit like lightning, searing and undeniable. He loved her, and letting her walk away was not an option. Jonathan collapsed into the chair by the desk, burying his face in his hands. For so long, he had lived for duty, his company, his employees, the expectations of men like Richard Whitmore. He had told himself sacrifice was strength, that building empires mattered more than building a life. But what good was an empire if it left him hollow? What good was victory if it cost him the only person who had managed to reach past his armor? He thought of his father, the man whose death had chained him to responsibility. Would his father have wanted him to choose profit over love? Would Daniel, Clara's husband, a man Jonathan had never known but somehow respected, have wanted her to spend the rest of her life lonely? Punishing herself for surviving, Jonathan's chest ached. He saw now that the real trap hadn't been Margaret Doyle's accusations or Richard Whitmore's disappointment. The real trap was the life he'd been living, safe, controlled, but utterly empty. And Clara had been his way out. He rose suddenly, the chair scraping against the floor. His decision was made, career or love. There was no contest. Jonathan strode to the door, the letter still clutched in his hand. Somewhere on this ship, Clara was preparing to disappear, and if he didn't stop her now, he would lose her forever. Meanwhile, Clara sat on the edge of her narrow cabin in the lower decks, the one she had requested to be transferred to when she'd slipped away from the suite. She stared at her packed bag, her chest hollow. She had told herself she was doing the right thing, that leaving was noble, necessary, that Jonathan would recover, his career intact, his empire secure. But every breath felt like drowning. For years, she had carried silence like a second skin. Tonight, she had found her voice only to use it to say goodbye. Her mind betrayed her with flashes of memory, Jonathan's quiet laugh on the deck, the way his eyes softened when she spoke of her past, the way his lips had felt on hers. Clara pressed a hand to her chest, whispering into the stillness. Why does it feel like I'm losing more than I ever lost? Before her body shook with silent sobs. She told herself morning would make it easier, that once she stepped off the ship, she'd be free. But a part of her already knew freedom without him would feel like another kind of prison. Back in the upper decks, Jonathan tore through corridors with a desperation he had never allowed himself to show. Guests and staff alike turned their heads as he passed, but he didn't care. For the first time in decades, he wasn't thinking about appearances, he was thinking only of her. He reached the lower levels, his heart pounding, the letter damp in his hand. "Clara," he shouted, his voice echoing down the narrow hallways. And in that cry, raw and unguarded, a man who had spent his life mastering control finally admitted he could not bear to lose the woman who had taught him how to feel again. The grand ballroom of the Serafina blazed with light, chandeliers glittering above rows of elegantly dressed guests. Tonight was the cruise's centerpiece, a gala to honor the Whitmore's foundation, a gathering where reputations were polished and alliances sealed. Jonathan stood at the edge of the room, his tuxedo immaculate, his tie knotted just so, but his composure was a mask stretched thin over turmoil. In his breast pocket, Clara's letter lay folded, the ink smudged by the sweat of his hand. Across the room, Clara slipped in quietly, intending to stay in the shadows. She had planned to vanish before the next port, but when she heard whispers of the gala, something inside her had pulled her back. Perhaps she wanted one last glimpse of him, of the man she had tried to leave behind. But what happened next would change everything. Richard Whitmore took the stage, his booming voice echoing across the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we celebrate not only generosity, but the bonds of trust that unite us. And no man embodies that spirit better than Jonathan Pierce, whose company has led the way in clean energy. Jonathan, would you join me?" Applause filled the room. Jonathan mounted the stage, every step deliberate, though inside, his chest hammered. He stood beside Richard, looking out at the sea of faces, investors, friends, skeptics, and somewhere among them, Clara. Richard clapped him on the shoulder. A man is measured not just by his success, but by the truth he carries. And Jonathan has proven himself time and again. The words cut. Jonathan's mouth went dry. He thought of the lie he'd carried for 2 years, the charade that had led to this very moment. He thought of Clara's trembling hand, of her whispered confession of loneliness, of her letter that had nearly broken him. The mask could no longer hold. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "I need to say something I should have said long ago." The room quieted, glasses paused mid-air, conversations died on lips. "I have not been honest with you," he said, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "Clara Henderson is not my wife. She never was." A stunned silence fell. Richard's smile faltered. Eleanor's brows lifted. Margaret Doyle's lips curled with vindication. Jonathan drew a breath, forcing himself onward. 2 years ago, I lied to a client. I told him I had remarried, believing it would make me seem more human, more trustworthy. That lie followed me here, and when I found myself cornered, I hired Clara to play the part, to play the wife I claimed I had. Gasps echoed, some scandalized, others intrigued. Margaret's eyes gleamed like a predator who had drawn blood. And yet, Jonathan continued, his voice deepening, in the middle of the lie, I found something real. Clara may not be my wife by law, but she has been more of a partner to me than I ever imagined possible. She's made me laugh when I thought I'd forgotten how. She's reminded me what it feels like to hope, to believe, to live. He let his words hang, raw and unvarnished. So no, she isn't my wife, but I no longer care about the contract, the deal, or the consequences. What I care about is her. The final words rang through the hall like a bell. Clara's chest clenched. For a moment, she couldn't move. She hadn't expected this. She had expected Jonathan to salvage his empire, to distance himself from her, to protect what he had built. But here he was, burning it all down for her. Her legs carried her forward before her mind could stop them. The crowd parted as she walked toward the stage, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. When she reached him, her voice trembled, but she made no attempt to hide it. "He's telling the truth," she said, facing the room. "I was hired. I agreed to play a part. At first, it was about money. I needed it desperately. I told myself I could endure the shame, the deception, for a chance to start over." Murmurs spread, but Clara lifted her chin. Her eyes found Jonathan's. Steady now, certain. But something happened that I didn't expect. Somewhere between the rehearsed smiles and the staged hand-holding, I started to feel something real. I started to see the man behind the reputation. And her voice broke, but she pushed on. "I fell in love with him." A collective hush swept the room. She turned fully to Jonathan, her tears glinting under the chandelier light. "You were right, Jonathan. This was supposed to be a lie, but it isn't anymore. For a heartbeat." The entire room seemed suspended in silence. The orchestra had stilled, the waiters frozen mid-step. Even Margaret Doyle struck speechless. Richard Whitmore's expression softened, his gaze shifting between Jonathan and Clara as though weighing something heavier than business. Eleanor leaned forward, eyes glistening with something dangerously close to approval. Finally, Richard's booming voice broke the stillness. "Well, I'll say this: lies have no place in business. But love, when it's real, can be the most honest truth of all." The words sent a ripple through the room. Not everyone was convinced Margaret's face was thunderous, but others began to nod, murmur, even smile. Jonathan reached for Clara's hand, pulling her close. "You don't have to stay," he whispered, his voice so soft only she could hear. "But I had to tell them. I had to tell you." Clara's throat tightened, "And I had to come back, because leaving you felt worse than any lie I've ever told. And in front of the entire ballroom, with reputations crumbling and futures uncertain." She leaned in and kissed him. The hall erupted, some in applause, some in shock, others in whispers that would ripple through the crews for days to come. But for Jonathan and Clara, the noise fell away. The kiss wasn't to convince anyone this time. It wasn't for the Whitmores, or for the investors, or even to silence Margaret Doyle. It was for them. And for the first time since this dangerous arrangement began, it was nothing but the truth. The ballroom was still thick with tension after Clara's confession. Guests sat frozen, torn between scandal and fascination. Some leaned forward, eager for more drama, while others whispered behind manicured hands. Margaret Doyle stood at the side of the stage, her face alight with triumph, as if she were savoring her victory over Jonathan Pierce. But then Eleanor Whitmore rose from her seat. The room hushed. Eleanor, with her graceful poise and diamond earrings that caught the chandelier light, commanded attention without needing to raise her voice. She walked to the center of the room, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, and turned to face the crowd. "Enough," she said. Her tone was calm but carried the weight of authority. All eyes snapped to her. Even Margaret faltered. Eleanor looked from Jonathan to Clara, then back to the audience. "I have been married to Richard Whitmore for 41 years. And if there's one thing I've learned in those decades, it's this: love is not proven by certificates, ceremonies, or society announcements. Love is proven by sacrifice, by the courage to stand in the truth, even when it costs you everything." Her gaze lingered on Clara, softening. "What I saw tonight wasn't a performance. It wasn't rehearsed. It was raw and messy and real. And for that reason alone, I will not stand by while anyone calls it a fraud." Murmurs rippled through the room, startled, curious, some even approving. Jonathan's shoulders eased, but he remained silent, wary of Richard's reaction. Clara blinked back tears, her heart swelling with an unexpected wave of gratitude. Margaret Doyle stepped forward, her composure tightening like armor. "Mrs. Whitmore, with respect, this isn't about sentiment. This is about integrity. Mr. Pierce lied to secure influence, and this woman was complicit. but Eleanor's expression sharpened. Integrity is not Margaret Doyle's monopoly. I saw you this afternoon, Margaret, pressing your accusations with relish. This was never about protecting Richard's interests. It was about destroying Jonathan's reputation to elevate your own. The accusation landed with a shockwave. Gasps echoed around the ballroom. Margaret's face flushed crimson. That is absurd! Is it? Eleanor cut in. Because I checked with Richard's office earlier this week. And do you know what I discovered? That you had already begun planting doubts long before this event. You wanted a spectacle. The murmurs grew louder, turning sharper. A few guests who had nodded along with Margaret earlier now frowned in her direction. Richard, who had been silent until now, finally rose to his feet. His booming presence silenced the whispers. Eleanor, he said, his voice low, warning, but she didn't waver. Richard, you pride yourself on loyalty, but loyalty means nothing without compassion. Can't you see what everyone else in this room sees? Jonathan Pierce may have lied? Yes, but the truth is standing right in front of us now. And the truth is that he loves this woman. Richard's jaw worked. His stern eyes moved to Jonathan, then to Clara, studying them as though weighing two sides of a scale. The silence stretched, heavy with expectation. Finally, Richard spoke. When Margaret first brought me her suspicions, I was furious. Betrayal in business is one thing, but betrayal of trust, that I cannot abide. His gaze locked onto Jonathan. I thought you were another man hiding behind numbers and charm. I thought you had tricked us. Jonathan's chest tightened. I did lie, he admitted, his voice carrying through the room. I lied once, and I've paid for it every day since. But what you saw tonight, that wasn't deception. That was the truth I can no longer ignore. He glanced at Clara, his expression softening. She is the truth. Clara's throat tightened. Richard looked between them once more. His sternness softened, just barely, like a crack in stone. Perhaps Eleanor is right. Perhaps what matters most isn't the lie that brought you here, but the honesty you've shown tonight. The room stirred with surprised approval. Margaret, desperate to regain control, snapped. Richard, you cannot be serious. You would throw away years of standards because of some emotional display. Richard's eyes hardened. Careful, Margaret. For the first time, the power balance had shifted. Margaret's voice faltered, her confidence unraveling as she saw the crowd turning. Some guests began murmuring words of support for Jonathan and Clara, others even clapping softly. Jonathan reached for Clara's hand, this time not as a performance, but as a declaration. She let him take it, her fingers curling into his with a strength that surprised even her. Eleanor smiled faintly. Do you hear that these people came tonight expecting business? But what they witnessed was something far rarer. A reminder that love, when it is true, is worth more than any contract. Clara's cheeks burned, but her heart swelled with warmth. She glanced around and saw faces softening, guests nodding, some even dabbing at their eyes. A woman at one of the front tables whispered, "It's like a story out of a novel." Jonathan leaned toward Clara, murmuring so only she could hear, "You see, for once, truth is winning." Clara's eyes glistened. She squeezed his hand tighter. Margaret, now visibly cornered, tried one last strike. This is madness. If you reward dishonesty with sympathy, you erode the very foundation of trust in this room. But Richard's reply was final. No, Margaret, what erodes trust is manipulation, and I cannot trust someone who takes pleasure in tearing others down. You've done enough. It was a dismissal, clear and absolute. Margaret's face drained of color. She gathered her folder of evidence with shaking hands and stormed out of the ballroom, her heels striking the marble like hammers of defeat. The crowd erupted in applause, not for her, but for Jonathan and Clara. Clara felt the sound wash over her like a tide, surreal and overwhelming. These people who had moments ago looked at her with suspicion were now clapping, smiling, some even rising to their feet. She turned to Jonathan, her voice a whisper. I never thought they'd believe in us. Jonathan's eyes softened, his voice thick. I didn't do this to make them believe. I did it to make you believe. Her breath caught, and in that moment, with Eleanor beaming proudly and Richard's sternness softened into something resembling respect, Clara realized something extraordinary. They weren't fighting alone anymore. The gala slowly emptied into the night, laughter and whispers trailing off into the corridors of the great ship. Yet, on the open deck, under the vast stretch of stars, the air was alive with a different kind of electricity. Guests gathered in clusters, still buzzing from the revelations of the evening, while the ocean stretched endlessly around them, dark and infinite. Clara stood near the railing, her shawl drawn close. The salt air kissed her face, and her heart still raced with the echo of what had unfolded hours earlier. She had told the truth. He had told the truth. And somehow, against every odd, they had not been destroyed. Instead, they stood stronger, bared to the world, and inexplicably freer. Jonathan moved to her side. His tuxedo jacket was open now, the bow tie undone, his posture less the untouchable CEO and more the man she had glimpsed on the quiet nights at sea. Vulnerable. Human. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Clara let out a shaky laugh. "I'm still standing. That counts for something." He studied her for a long moment. "You've been standing for a long time." Clara. Alone. Carrying too much. "I see that now." Her throat tightened. She didn't reply. She couldn't. The guests behind them began to drift closer, drawn by something in the air, a sense that another chapter was about to unfold. Eleanor stood with Richard near the back, her eyes alight with curiosity. Jonathan glanced at the gathering, then back at Clara, and before she could make sense of what he was about to do, he dropped to one knee. Gasps rippled across the deck. A hush fell so complete that even the waves seemed to pause. Clara's breath caught. "Jonathan," he held her hand in both of his, looking up at her with eyes unguarded and certain. His voice carried across the deck, not loud, but steady. Every word meant for her, and her alone. "Clara Henderson, you walked into my life when I was drowning in my own lies. You were supposed to be a role, a temporary answer to a problem of my own making. But somewhere between the pretending and the truth, I found you, the real you, and I don't ever want to let you go." Her heart hammered in her chest. "I don't care about contracts or reputations or what anyone in this room thinks. What I care about is this: I love you. I love the woman who talks to her plants, who laughs at the wrong moments, who has carried more grief than anyone should and still stands with grace. I love the way you've made me remember who I wanted to be before the world told me who I had to be." His voice cracked then, but he pressed on. "So, I'm asking you not as Jonathan Pierce, CEO, but as Jonathan, a man who has finally found his heart again. Will you marry me?" The world tilted. Clara's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide, wet with tears. For a heartbeat, she was frozen between past and future. Her mind screamed with doubts. "You've known him for only days. You'll look like a fool. What about Daniel? What about the promise you thought you'd never break?" But then she saw his eyes, open and raw, and she heard again the words she had spoken in front of the crowd. "I fell in love with him." Because she had, against reason, against time, against every wall she had built to keep her heart safe, she had fallen. Clara trembled, her voice barely a whisper. "Jonathan, this is insane." He smiled faintly. "It is. But some of the best decisions in life are—" She let out a broken laugh through her tears, shaking her head in disbelief. "I never thought I'd—" Her voice faltered. "I never thought I'd feel this way again." Jonathan's grip on her hand tightened. "Then, let yourself feel it. Say yes." "Clara." The silence stretched, the crowd holding its collective breath. And then, with tears spilling freely down her cheeks, Clara whispered, "Yes!" The deck erupted. Applause thundered, cheers rang out, and Eleanor let out a delighted laugh as Richard shook his head in reluctant approval. Jonathan rose, pulling Clara into his arms. The kiss that followed wasn't staged, wasn't careful. It was fierce, tender, and utterly real. As if the universe itself had conspired to mark the moment. Fireworks burst suddenly from the shoreline in the distance. Crimson, gold, and silver bloomed against the night sky, their reflections dancing across the water. The crowd gasped and cheered again, as though the heavens had blessed their vow. The waves lapped gently against the hull, the stars shimmered above, and the ship seemed, for that moment, to float in a world entirely their own. When they finally broke apart, Jonathan rested his forehead against hers. "You've just made me the happiest man alive." Clara laughed through her tears, her hands trembling on his face. "I hope you know what you've done, Jonathan Pierce. You've just tied yourself to a very complicated woman." He smiled, his eyes shining. "Good, because I've been complicated my whole life. Now, I finally have the right reason to be." The crowd erupted into another wave of applause as Clara buried her face against his shoulder, overwhelmed but radiant. And beneath the canopy of stars, with the ocean as their witness and the world watching, Clara Henderson and Jonathan Pierce made a promise that had nothing to do with lies, contracts, or appearances. It was a promise of love. The morning sun spread a soft gold over the rolling hills of Vermont. Mist rose from the meadows, drifting like smoke above the grass, while the scent of pine and damp earth hung fresh in the air. The farm was modest, nothing like the glass towers of Chicago or the glittering ballroom of the Serafina. Yet, for Clara Henderson and Jonathan Pierce, it was paradise. Clara pushed open the back door of their farmhouse, a mug of coffee warming her hands. She stepped out onto the porch, where a wide swing creaked gently in the breeze. Their dog, a scruffy golden retriever named Huck, bounded across the yard, chasing a rabbit that vanished beneath the fence. She laughed softly. It was a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years, a sound that had become natural again. Jonathan emerged from the barn, sleeves rolled up, his once immaculate hair tousled by the wind. He carried a basket of eggs from the chickens, his boots still damp from the morning dew. He looked nothing like the billionaire who had once commanded boardrooms with a single glance. And yet, to Clara, he had never looked more himself. "Morning," he said, setting the basket on the porch rail. "Coffee ready." She lifted the mug in her hand with a smile, already warm. He leaned down and kissed her cheek, Huck circling them with happy barks. A year had passed since that night under the stars. The world had not forgotten their scandalous confession on the cruise, but Jonathan had surprised everyone by stepping away from the storm instead of trying to fight it. He had sold a large portion of his company, keeping only the divisions focused on renewable energy projects close to his heart. The rest, he handed over to trusted partners. The move had stunned the business world, but Jonathan never looked back. "An empire can run without me," he had told Clara once. "But I don't want to miss my own life anymore." So, they left Chicago, left the glittering skyline and relentless pace, and came to Vermont. The farmhouse had been Clara's dream, a place where she could breathe, write, and build something with her hands instead of her fears. Jonathan had agreed without hesitation. Life here was slower, richer. They planted apple trees in the spring, their branches now full of blossoms that promised fruit come autumn. Clara tended a garden filled with tomatoes, beans, and herbs, while Jonathan built raised beds and learned to mend fences. Neighbors often stopped by, curious at first to see the famous Jonathan Pierce mucking stalls and hauling hay. But soon, he became simply John, the man who donated solar panels to the community center and who volunteered to coach the high school debate team. Clara's mother lived in the farmhouse with them now, her health fragile but her spirit strong. Clara cherished the mornings spent reading aloud to her, the afternoons walking slowly together down the gravel lane. For the first time in years, Clara felt she wasn't carrying everything alone. Jonathan was there, steady, present, willing, and Clara herself had begun something new. In the evenings after the chores were done and the sun dipped behind the hills, she sat at her desk by the window and wrote. Her book, tentatively titled Love and Second Chances, had begun as a journal of her own journey, but it had grown into something larger, stories of resilience, of grief transformed into growth, of the courage it takes to let love in after loss. Jonathan often teased her gently when he found her lost in her pages. "You're going to change more lives with that book than I ever did with $1 billion company." She would laugh, but in her heart, she hoped he might be right. That morning, as she and Jonathan sat side by side on the porch swing, Huck sprawled at their feet. Clara glanced at him and smiled. "Do you ever miss it?" He raised an eyebrow. "What?" "The endless meetings, the boardrooms, the way Margaret Doyle used to glare at me across every conference table." She chuckled. "The empire, the power, the life you had before." Jonathan took her hand, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "I don't miss a second of it. I used to think I needed it that without the company. I'd be nothing. But then I met you, and I realized the truth. Power doesn't fill the silence. Love does." Her heart swelled. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the quiet of the Vermont morning wrapping around them. Later that day, they walked the fields together, the grass brushing against their boots, Huck darting ahead. Clara carried a basket of herbs for dinner, while Jonathan carried a small wooden box he'd been tinkering with in the barn. "What's that?" she asked. He grinned boyishly. "Something for you? A lockbox? For when you finish your manuscript? I figured every great book deserves a safe place before it goes out into the world." Clara laughed, her eyes stinging with affection. "You're ridiculous. And hopelessly in love," he added without shame. She shook her head, smiling through her tears. "I never thought I'd get this. Not again." He stopped walking, turned her to face him. "Clara, this isn't again. This is new. This is ours." She kissed him then, the breeze carrying the scent of apple blossoms and soil. That evening, as the sky burned orange and purple with sunset, Clara sat with her notebook open, writing. Jonathan played fetch with Huck in the yard, his laughter carrying across the fields. Her pen moved easily now, the words flowing like water. Sometimes, life gives us second chances. Not the kind we expect, not the kind we plan, but the kind that arrive when we're finally brave enough to let go of what we lost and embrace what is before us. Love doesn't erase grief, it honors it. And sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is let ourselves live again. She set the pen down, tears shining in her eyes, and looked out at Jonathan as he scooped Huck into his arms, both man and dog grinning like fools. Clara smiled. For the first time in a long time, her heart was both full and free. The old barn had been cleared of hay bales and tools, its wooden beams now wrapped in strings of white lights that twinkled like captured stars. Neighbors brought flowers, baskets of apples, and homemade pies. The smell of wood smoke and cinnamon filled the Vermont air, mingling with laughter and the sound of fiddles warming up for music. It wasn't a ballroom on a luxury ship. It wasn't staged for investors or society photographers. It was simple, imperfect, utterly theirs. Clara stood at the barn doors, her hands trembling slightly as she held a small bouquet of daisies. She wore a cream-colored dress, comfortable, unassuming, and chosen by herself, not by a stylist or assistant. The woman staring back at her from the small mirror propped against a beam wasn't a character anymore. She wasn't pretending to be a billionaire's wife. She was simply Clara Henderson, alive, loved, and ready to promise her heart again. Jonathan waited at the front, wearing a plain linen shirt and slacks, his hair dusted with silver at the temples. His eyes lit up the moment he saw her. No diamonds, no cameras, just that gaze, unwavering, steady, and full of a love that asked for nothing but the chance to last. Eleanor and Richard Whitmore were there too, sitting among the neighbors on wooden benches. Eleanor dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, whispering to Richard, "This is how love is supposed to look." He nodded gruffly, though even his eyes softened. The music hushed. Clara's mother, frail but smiling, rose with the help of a cane. She had insisted on officiating, her voice strong despite the years. Today, she began, we are not here for wealth, or contracts, or pretense. We are here for something rarer, something stronger. We are here because two people found the courage to begin again. Clara's eyes burned as Jonathan reached for her hands. His palms were rough now from farm work, but she loved the feel of them more than any polished handshake from his boardroom days. Jonathan, her mother said, do you promise to stand by Clara not as a shield, not as a mask, but as her partner, her equal, her love? Jonathan's voice was clear, steady. I do, with every breath I have. And Clara, do you promise to walk beside Jonathan, not in someone else's story, not in someone else's image, but in the life you choose together? Clara's tears spilled freely as she whispered, I do, with my whole heart. They had written their own vows. Jonathan went first. I once thought love was something you could calculate, manage, or fake, if necessary. But then I met you, and I learned the truth. Love isn't an arrangement, it's surrender, it's trust. It's the willingness to be seen for who we are. Clara, I see you, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel alone again. The crowd was silent, breath held in reverence. Clara took a shaky breath and began. I once thought my life had already been lived. That losing Daniel meant losing every chance at joy, at love, at being seen again. But you showed me that beginnings don't belong only to the young. You showed me that women of every age, every past, every scar, we deserve to begin again. Jonathan, I don't promise perfection. I promise truth. I promise to stand with you, to argue with you, to laugh with you, and to love you without pretending. This time, no masks, no roles, only us. Jonathan squeezed her hands, and she felt his shoulders shake as if he, too, were holding back tears. The fiddles began to play a slow, sweet tune. Guests clapped and cheered, not with the polite applause of business partners, but with the unguarded joy of friends and neighbors. Huck barked happily, weaving between benches as the couple sealed their vows with a kiss. Clara laughed into it, tears on her cheeks, her heart light as air. Later, as they danced under the barn lights, Clara leaned close to Jonathan's ear. Her voice was a whisper, meant only for him. This time, she said, no pretending, only us. He held her tighter, murmuring back, only us, always. Their story was not about a fake marriage that fooled the world. It was about the moment they stopped pretending. It was about the courage to admit the truth, even when it meant risking everything. It was about the truth that women, no matter their age or history, are never too late for love, for reinvention, for joy. And it was about the wild, impossible decisions, the ones that defy reason, that look reckless from the outside, that sometimes save us, because they wake us up to life again. Jonathan and Clara's vow renewal wasn't the end of their story. It was the proof that love, when honest, is stronger than any contract, scandal, or lie. The guests cheered, the music soared, and the stars outside the barn glimmered like witnesses. And if anyone asked them what lesson they had learned, Clara would smile, rest her head against Jonathan's chest, and answer simply, love is never about pretending. Love is about showing up, truthfully, and choosing each other again and again. Clara and Jonathan's story reminds us of something we often forget as we grow older. It is never too late to begin again. Love does not belong only to the young or to those whose lives have gone according to plan. It belongs to anyone brave enough to open their heart even after loss, even after disappointment, even when it feels impossible. Their journey shows that honesty matters more than appearances, and that living behind masks, whether to please others or to protect ourselves, can only keep us lonely. True connection comes when we dare to be seen exactly as we are, and sometimes the decisions that seem reckless to the world, the yes whispered through tears, the step into the unknown, become the very choices that save us. For women, especially those who have carried the weight of family, grief, or sacrifice. This story is a gentle reminder you are worthy of joy, of being chosen, and of second chances. So, If life offers you an unexpected door, however strange or risky it looks, don't be afraid to walk through it. Because often, what feels like madness at first can turn out to be the beginning of your greatest truth. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and for listening to this story of love, truth, and second chances. If it touched your heart, please give it a like. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that it's never too late to begin again. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep bringing you stories that inspire, heal, and shine a little light into the world.